Welcome to the Colaba conversation. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation America, or of America, based in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to be recording this conversation today with Nadia Schadlow. Nadia is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, but was previously Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy in the White House. And in that role was responsible for, amongst other things, the formulation of the 2017 U.S. national security strategy, which led to a great deal of discussion and debate and set the terms for policy, U.S. Strategic policy for much of the last few years. We're having this conversation at a very interesting time. We're just a few days away from transition, U.S. political leadership transition, and the swearing in of President-elect Joe Biden in Washington in a few days' time. And so in some ways, it makes for a very timely conversation on the changing government and how much of the U.S. national security strategy and the elements within it, particularly with respect to the Indo-Pacific, will survive and will continue under a new administration. So I look forward to having a discussion with Nadia over the next 30 minutes on that. Nadia, thank you for taking your time to join us. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came on in that role? What was a very critical role as Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy. At the time, I believe General H.R. McMaster was National Security Advisor. So how did that come about?
Sure. Well, first of all, Dhruva, it's wonderful to be here. I wish I was actually there in person in India. I had the opportunity to travel there several years ago to participate in the Raisina dialogue, and that was wonderful. But obviously, I only saw a tiny part of your incredibly interesting country. So hopefully one day I can return. I really look forward to this opportunity. I'll start a little bit. When I started at the White House in early 2017, as you said, yes, I had been brought on to specifically work on the U.S. national security strategy. The national security strategy is a document that's required by our Congress. So every administration is supposed to come in and fulfill the writing of the national security strategy. I had had a lot of background essentially in strategic issues. Most of my career had focused on looking at the landscape of the problem sets and opportunities facing the United States. I'd worked for an organization that funded a lot of the research and analysis related to these questions. So I was familiar with the issues. In addition, I had done my own writing on the topic. And I was, so essentially I took that background and was able to have a foundation and a framework for thinking about, what the world looked like. And a national security strategy, in essence, in my view, is setting a strategic direction for a new administration. So to do that, you need to essentially describe the problems and the opportunities in a particular geopolitical landscape. And that's really how we began. So I think the national security strategy of 2017 really made it a priority to accurately describe the landscape as we saw it in the White House. So that's a starting point, and I can go into sort of what that landscape was and what the differences were, but I want to give you a chance also to comment.
Sure. I mean, I think some of the things that struck people when they saw the strategy in December of 2017, one was a very clear articulation of U.S. adversaries, and particularly China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. How would you say that came about? I mean, it seemed very intentional to try and identify at least where the key challenges to the U.S. were coming from?
Well, I think it came about because it was clear. Essentially, the fundamental idea behind the strategy was that the world was a competitive place, that there were competitions taking place in the military domain, in the economic domain, in the diplomatic, political domains, all driven by technology. In addition, there was its own, technological competition in service of these other domains. So it was clear that those problem sets had been growing over the past, since really the end of the Cold War period, but certainly since 2005. And so this had been, I think well known in many circles. So if you read both individuals at the Brookings Institution, where I knew you had a previous role, as well as what individuals at the Carnegie Endowment were saying, or at the Hudson Institute, or at the American Enterprise Institute. You had a range of analysts who had been expressing and writing about their concerns about these growing competitions, in particular vis-a-vis China, because it was so good at these competitions, right? It was really asserting itself across these domains. So the strategy captured that and basically said that we needed to acknowledge these competitions in a more forthright way, because unless we did so, we would remain behind and our competitiveness across these domains would be reduced. So I think that it was, to many people, it was actually a welcome relief because they had seen what had been taking place. Fundamentally, I'd say the strategy challenged sort of four post-Cold War views. It challenged the view that China would be a constructive part of the liberal international order, which had been a hope after its entry into the WTO in 2001. It challenged the view that technology would be an unmitigated good. In other words, it sort of put forth that maybe technology would actually advance authoritarians, right, instead of democracies. We needed to deal with that. It challenged the view that the United States would remain uncontested militarily. It acknowledged that actually we were contested across all domains, all military domains, air, sea, space, cyber, and we needed to do better in order not to lose those competitions in the military domain. So those were some of the ideas behind the strategy. And then the goal was to set forth actual lines of action to start to address and change the direction that we were going in. And of course, to shift things after a decade of doing things differently takes time. And that's sort of where we are now, I think.
One of the other things, the big takeaways, was that the first geographic area that was described in detail in the national security strategy was the Indo-Pacific. And at that point, it had already been, that terminology at least had featured in official documents in Japan and Australia. We'd seen then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson speaking about the Indo-Pacific a few months earlier in September, I believe, October of that year. So how did that come about, the sort of focus on the Indo-Pacific front and center in the national security strategy?
Well, I think essentially it was seen as a region where all of what I've just described was playing out in toto, sort of, right? Where everything that I had just talked about was playing out. And the Asia team at the NSC was very strong. I think most of you probably know Matt Pottinger, who is my colleague. He was a key intellectual force behind this. So essentially, there was again, this had been building over time. It was clear that this was a phrase that we had that had been out there for some time, with the Japanese putting it forth, as well as key members of the Indian government in the past. So it was decided that essentially this is where elements of this competition were playing out, and we should put it front and center. And I think it was a very successful example of how we saw strategic alignments across all states in the region, or most states in the Indo-Pacific, I think appreciated that shift. And we began to see those alignments unfold as individual countries in the region began to develop their own concepts also of the Indo-Pacific. Australia, India, Japan. So I think that's essentially all the elements, many of the elements of the strategy, ensuring that there were reciprocal trade agreements, looking at defense cooperation relationships in the region and strengthening them. All of that came together in the Indo-Pacific, and I can talk about that some more as well.
Sure. So in the 3 years since then, how would you assess? The national security strategy in some ways led to the national defense strategy, led to other policy documents and articulations by the US government over the past 3 years. How would you say the implementation of the national security strategy has played out? Where are areas that you think the US government has done a relatively good job? Where would you see works in progress, or where would you see relative disappointment?
Yeah, I think the implementation has played out fairly well. I think there's a very strong foundation for the continued implementation of it. I think that often, unfortunately, it hasn't been covered as much. So in the military side, we've seen very strong bilateral defense relationships and quadrilateral defense relationships across the region in terms of concrete terms, in terms of weapon sales, new types of defense cooperation, giving India a defense trade status almost equivalent to NATO allies as examples. Probably the strongest US Japan bilateral relationship in a long time. And I can go on, increased freedom of navigation operations. You've also seen the Indo-Pacific construct taken up by France has been a very strong leader in this as well, which is good because this is also about allies and partners. So I think you've actually seen, well, you have seen actually a lot of concrete cooperation in the defense and military sphere. In the economic sphere, also, you've seen pressure for reciprocity, for trade relationships that are fair, for pressure against IP theft. All of those activities you've seen in the Indo-Pacific, also driven again by countries, by India and other countries in the region who themselves understand what's at stake. On the political side, I think you see the alignments that I've spoken about. All of the countries in the region are talking about and developing their own Indo-Pacific strategies that are complementary to the US one, which then strengthens it. So I think you've seen a range of actual sets of activities in these domains. In addition, there have been new economic tools as well that are often not discussed. There are new approaches to help the US be able to do its infrastructure investments more effectively, the strengthening of the Exim Bank, the creation of a new organization called the Development Finance Corporation, which strengthens our ability to push back and to develop different investments sort of in terms of in contrast to where China is with OBOR, for instance. So you've seen activities in all of these domains. Finally, one other area also related to the economic and technology, you've seen increased Department of Justice investigations of IP theft, the theft of intellectual property. You've seen an increase in CFIUS, which is designed to protect US property and companies that have national security value from adverse investments from China and other countries. So I could go on, but I think it's actually a mistake to say, to discount those activities, because then you're left in a position for not building upon them, right? So I think the Biden administration now has an excellent opportunity to build on these policies in all of these areas. And I think in many senses, they will, at least in terms of what I've been able to read about their intentions.
I mean, just on that note, before I'd like to get into sort of a discussion on a Biden administration and how they might take some of this forward. But before that, I mean, would you say there are areas such as, say, multilateral trade agreements or investments in the defense sector or investments in R&D, where you think the U.S. government could have done more to implement or to see through some policies that would help it address some of the challenges you identified?
I think we initiated kind of a framework for thinking about what strategic decoupling means, essentially. So what does it mean to reduce American vulnerability in key sectors? And actually, there was a lot done in terms of a start toward that. So the Defense Department played a very big role in saying, hey, we're going to really step back and look much more carefully at investments in early stage tech companies that have national security implications. And we're going to look carefully at investments by China or firms that are sort of, covering for China. So that was, that's concrete and very important. We need to build on that. Getting DoD to do anything with agility and speed is hard. As we both know, our defense establishments are not the most agile institutions. Looking at debating, looking at the semiconductor area as well today, right? There have been executive orders saying we need to look at this. It's a very complicated area, but I think there's a sense now of thinking about industrial policy, which in the United States is not always a popular term, but thinking about how to reduce our vulnerability in these key areas. It's underway now. One of the last initiatives was to look at incentives to bring the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to the United States to provide us possibly with a better capability to produce chips. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses of that approach, but these are conversations that the Biden administration will need to have. There were calls to increase funding in artificial intelligence and other domains. There are lots of bills now, bipartisan bills in Congress that exist, from the CHIPS Act to the American Foundries Act, to what will soon be the findings of a National Commission on Artificial Intelligence. So I think a lot of this is underway. Can we do more? Of course, we can always do more and we can always do better. But I think as a country, we also need to figure out what our operational concept is for funding in those areas. That might be too sort of policy geeky, but what that means essentially, is, does the US government have a concept for how it goes about its research and development funding, at what stage, what kinds of organizations, things like that.
Now, moving ahead, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're just a few days away from a new administration in Washington. President-elect Joe Biden will be inaugurated soon. Perhaps it will have been done by the time this is you're viewing this. His national security team has also been completed in some ways, or at least at the senior level, with Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense, and down to the undersecretary level. Key undersecretary positions have now been filled, as well as the National Security Council Secretariat staff, senior directors. So now that you know the identity of some of the key players will be in policy formulation over the next year, where do you see this foundation that you have articulated here for an Indo-Pacific strategy for the United States? Where do you see this going forward?
I think the new administration will come in actually with a very strong foundation of tools that they can use, right? They essentially will come in with a lot of leverage. So it'll remain to be seen how that leverage will be used. But Chinese companies, there's been pressure to delist them and to use their to ensure that companies listed on the U.S. Stock market exchanges are in fact open and transparent as other companies. So these are tools, and these are things that China doesn't like. Use of tariffs, which President-elect Biden has said he will not actually do away with initially. Tools, as I mentioned, for overseas lending through the BUILD Act, through the Exim Bank. There's an entity list in place by our Commerce Department, which has implications for selling certain components of semiconductor chips and other components to Chinese companies. As I mentioned, Department of Justice prosecutions of Chinese nationals who are engaged in IP theft. The use in the cyber domain of new operational concepts like defend forward and persistent engagement, the continued sale and close cooperative defense relationships between the US and India, between the US and Japan, between other countries in the region. So the foundation is set. That's a lot of leverage going in, I think, for Biden administration, because all of these are areas that China's not exactly happy about, right? So these provide opportunities for negotiations, because I think we'll also see more of an emphasis, and this isn't new information, on climate change, right? Mm-hmm. With Kerry as the climate change czar and with an agenda in that domain. So the important thing will be to see how those goals and sets of activities play out, essentially. Mm-hmm. How much will we give up for progress in climate? How do we ensure that we get more than just commitments as opposed to actual progress, right? There's a difference. Mm-hmm. But I think the Biden administration is actually going in quite a strong position vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific and vis-a-vis China.
Mm-hmm. In your sense, in both when you were in government and subsequently, when you were engaging with some of the people who will now be going into the executive branch, but also Democrats on the Hill, again, my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the issues related to China was one area where there wasn't as much. The partisan divides aren't as sharp, at least, or there's more room for consensus. Is that your sense, or do you think that there still are a lot of work needs to be done to sensitize, whether it's people on the Hill, people in the executive branch, even in the private sector, about some of the challenges you have articulated?
Yeah. I think fundamentally you're right, Dhruva. There is a basic bipartisan consensus on the challenges, But I think there are differences in how it all plays out in terms of also the tools and instruments and a willingness perhaps to push back harder in the way the Trump administration did, and how that will play out in a Biden administration. I think there are also differences on the degree to which the competition is ideological, right? I think there are differences in how much, to go back to climate, you're willing to make trade-offs in the climate domain. I think there are also probably some fundamental differences about whether or not you can separate areas like climate from China's overall goals vis-a-vis its economic and political system. I don't think you can, but I think there are others who think you can. So I think there are differences in some of the sub issues, but fundamentally there's a sense that China is a competitor. Some will argue about whether or not it's an adversary. Some will argue whether or not we should look at China in a more cooperative engagement mode. But I think overall the center agrees on China as a competitor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think China itself, Chinese leaders are interested in shifting toward the latter, toward the engagement cooperative mode, right? And we've seen key op-eds, and we've seen actually a very smart strategy to push in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Foreign Minister Wang Yi as well gave a speech which he seemed to extend that possibility to the incoming administration. Having gone through that process yourself of drafting and formulating a national security strategy, what advice, if any, would you have for a Biden administration coming in as to what were some of the pitfalls, what were some of the unexpected aspects of that process?
I think my advice would be to first get it done sooner rather than later, right? You're never going to get complete agreement among all departments and agencies. Dhruva, you know how governments work on both sides, and right there, mm-hmm. it's a contentious bunch. Everyone mm-hmm. wants their say, so you have to balance that. Otherwise, if you wait too long, you haven't set a strategic direction. I would say too, remember, the need to build coalitions, because ultimately, the White House has no real authority and no money and no power to get anything done in terms of implementation. Implementation in our system is done by the departments and agencies, by the Defense Department, by the State Department, mm-hmm. by USAID. So in order to get them to move in the same direction and actually implement what you'd like, they need to be on board too, and they need to be heard. And so you need to balance timing with that. But I think it can be done, because I think we did that. So those are some of the areas. I think you also have to decide, what audience are you speaking to? Primarily to the American people, to allies and partners, to other departments and agencies, and you'll have to make some trade-offs too in your language. And I would also encourage them to be clear in their language, and to look at, to consider, outcomes, and not to emphasize process over outcomes, which I think is sometimes a pattern that we can fall into. You want to engage, you want to have dialogue, but you also want to measure actual progress on complex issues. So those would be some of the pieces of advice, although I'm not sure I'll be asked. but not to turn the tables on my interviewer, but I'm actually interested in, you've written a lot, Dhruva, on the Indo-Pacific and on US-India relations, and what are some of the areas that you're hopeful about going forward, or do you think elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy will remain intact, or are you concerned?
Well, I'm not the one being interviewed, but I think briefly, I think the two things. I think a lot of patience is required particularly in today's media environment. There's an expectation. Why isn't the new administration isn't even in place, and people are already dissecting. What are things that the terminology that President-elect Biden has used, and what have the key principles been written in the past few years and things like that. And I think it's useful. I mean, I've followed at least 4 or 5 presidential transitions now, and we need to give them time to settle in, to take stock of the world around them. And I think if in the first year, that is by the end of 2021, they're able to indicate that they're willing to sustain some of the more constructive and elements, at least with the India relationship, at least the 2+2 dialogue that has been put into place, that's a defense ministry and foreign ministry led dialogue. the Quad discussions at a senior level, and articulate national security strategy. I think those are the key things I would look for, but not necessarily in the first 3-4 months when everyone's still coming up to speed. More likely by the end of the year. So I think that would be a positive sign that that foundation that you articulated is being built upon. Finally, I mean, we're running short of time. I think we have 3-4 minutes left. What are some things, I think, no matter the even if you set aside the current administration or the incoming administration, what are some of the longer structural challenges that you foresee to the US ability to compete with China in the Indo-Pacific?
I think one of the biggest structural challenges we face is the ability of the United States to set long-term goals and stick to them, because every 4 years we have new elections, and there's a tendency to sort of start fresh all the time. And so we sort of are at a persistent disadvantage in some ways by not building on the successes of a previous administration. And we need to be very careful that partisanship, which is obviously right now just, I don't know how it could get higher in the country, right? Where we're really going through a difficult time as a country. So there's a tendency to throw everything out. And I think that's a mistake, because that makes it harder to create and sustain the building blocks of a long-term competitive strategy. That's one. Another is to think competitively in domains that we aren't used to thinking competitively, and in those political ideological domains, or I mean, at least in the recent past, right? During the Cold War we were, but in the economic domain, getting the US private sector and the private sector of other countries as well, and India as well, to think also competitively and to think about what their role is in these competitions. That's a really big challenge, and we haven't sort of settled on that yet either. And they will play a very important part. So I think that those are some of the challenges, to still getting the American people to understand really what's at stake in the long term, and to consider that our two systems, which are very, very different, are not likely to converge. And so what that long term competition is going to look like, well into the future. And then in terms of a country, we need to get better at all the things that everyone has talked about. And it's true, to improve our education system in this country, make sure there really is equality of opportunity, to improve our education in STEM. I mean, all of these domestic problems that we're having that will actually impact the competition and give us the freedom of action we need to make good choices, better choices for free and open societies.
Final point, I think we have a minute left. Again, it's a few days after the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Many people around the world see this as a sort of a low point for the U.S. politically. But this is my personal view. I mean, I think there are also great reasons for optimism about the United States' future. What are some of the areas where you think the U.S. has strengths that are really underappreciated? When you're thinking about, again, this long-term international competition.
Well, I think our people, our ideology, our belief in equality of opportunity, our desire to get things done as Americans, our entrepreneurial, innovative spirit, all of those things are great strengths of America. We still have a country, and we have our rules and our principles and our Constitution. These are institutions of our country that have held through pressure, and these are institutions that will continue to allow the best of the United States, to flourish. So I think that we are, I think we have great strengths. We just need to. I think we need to regain our confidence in ourselves, which is very important going forward. I think we need to improve our dialogue across the aisle in our country going forward, so that we can actually get things done, so that government can facilitate some of what I just talked about and not be an obstacle to this great, innovative, entrepreneurial, generous culture that defines America.
Well, thank you. I think we're out of time. Thank you for that remarkable discussion. I certainly learned a lot about processes, about things in place, about the worldview of the US government in some ways going forward, the strengths, the weaknesses, the challenges. But thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us at the Colaba Conversations on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And I'll continue to read the work and the writing that you and the Observer Research Foundation do. I find it very informative, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So thank you, and have a great day.